Thanks for tuning in to Russell Investments Market Week in Review for the week ending May 10th, 2024. I'm your host, McKenna Painter. Joining me here today in sunny Seattle is my colleague, investment strategist, Bei-Chen Lin. On today's episode, we have more to celebrate than just the sunshine. In honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we have a special segment prepared for you guys, so be sure to stay tuned until the end. All right, first item on the agenda, the Bank of England and the Reserve Bank of Australia. They held press conferences this week. Give me your highlights from those two.
Yeah, so even though both central banks left their key interest rate unchanged, we saw a bit of a difference in terms of the tone of the message. So on the one hand, when we look at what happened at the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England actually signaled that because of how the economic conditions are evolving, it's possible that they might even need to cut interest rates at some point by more than what the market is expecting. Meanwhile, on the other hand, with the Reserve Bank of Australia, you had the Reserve Bank of Australia saying that they've done a lot of good work in getting inflation back towards target, but in recent months it's been more of an uphill battle, and they are prepared, if necessary, to even potentially hike rates even more if they need to make sure that inflation goes back towards their inflation target. Ultimately, with both the Bank of England and the Reserve Bank of Australia, these central banks are, just like the other developed market central banks, data dependent. So whether they ultimately leave rates steady, whether they eventually cut rates, it's all going to depend on how the inflation data plays out, how the labor market data plays out. So we'll just need to watch attentively and really analyze the data as it comes in.
Well, numbers don't lie, and who doesn't love a good data set? Moving on to our next topic, the labor market. What's happening over there in that sector? Where are the differences between the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, sure, McKenna. So when we look at the U.S. labor market today on Thursday, May 9th, we had some weekly jobless claims come out, and those were a little bit higher than they were in the most recent weeks. But from our perspective here at Russell Investments, nothing too concerning just yet. When we zoom out a little bit and look at the broader labor market picture in the U.S., particularly when we think about the April payrolls data that was released last week, what we do see is evidence that the labor market is probably cooling a bit. So unlike in the first quarter of 2024, the April payrolls numbers actually showed that job creation came in somewhat below consensus expectations, but it was still a healthy pace of job creation, and it was still relatively in line with what economists call the replacement rate, which is the amount of job creation you need to sustain a constant unemployment rate. The situation is a little bit different in Canada, where the Canadian labor market has been much more fragile than the U.S. labor market. We're going to get the latest Canadian labor market data this Friday, actually. But based on consensus expectations, the consensus is looking for job creation in Canada to come in below the so-called replacement rate. That is, we're going to see job creation in Canada weaker than that needed to maintain a constant unemployment rate. And that's been a trend that we've seen in Canada for a few months now, which is one reason why the unemployment rate has increased in Canada. So when we think about our outlook for the U.S. economy versus for the Canadian economy, for the U.S. side, we do expect that the U.S. economy will likely soften somewhat in 2024, but we expect it to soften to a soft landing rather than to a recession. Now, we're not ruling out the possibility of recession altogether. We still think there's a 35% probability of recession in the U.S., but our base case for the U.S. is soft landing over the next 12 to 18 months. Canada, unfortunately, because of the weaker data and because of a higher amount of leverage that Canadian households have, we think recession probability is more elevated there at about 55%, which means recession we think is more likely than not in Canada over the next 12 to 18 months. But once again, we think that any potential recession would be on the mild to moderate side rather than on the severe side. So nothing for people to be overly panicked about at this point in time.
Definitely some things to keep in mind. All right, moving on to our third and final topic for the day, the U.S. equity markets. They're nearing all-time highs, but why should we still be somewhat cautious?
That's a great question, McKenna, and you alluded to this special segment earlier in our episode, but in honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Month here in the U.S. and also Asian Heritage Month up in Canada, we're actually going to answer your question in Mandarin. 其实 McKenna, 我觉得您提到的这个问题是个非常好的问题。那当我们考虑什么是投资的精髓，其实我觉得投资最重要的就是去衡量机会和风险的。那如果我们在考虑这个投资的机会，我们觉得确实今年有些东西可能是对我们来看比较好的消息，比如今年在美国、在加拿大、在欧洲、在英国，可能这些央行有办法降息，我们知道降息会对股市有利的。但是我们觉得这些风险也没有完全消失掉， 像我们在讨论美国经济衰退的这个可能性，我们觉得美国在下个12到18个月的这个时间以内，可能有个35%的可能性会进入经济衰退的状况。那如果我们看一个普通的年呢，美国一般是有个15%到20年的概率会进入经济衰退的状况，35%是高于15%到20%的。所以呢，我们就是觉得，因为还是有些风险在那边，我们觉得在这个时候，投资者，特别是当这个标普500一直在创造，或者是特别是在标普500靠近新高的时候，我们觉得这个时候投资者最好是比较谨慎、比较保守一些的。这个时候呢，没有必要去追进股市，没有必要去重仓股票，但是就保持一个比较冷静的一个态度，可能是比较好的一个做法。
Wow, Bei-Chin, you never cease to amaze me, and looks like it's time for me to re-download Duolingo. As always, it's been a pleasure, and to our viewers at home, we'll see you next week.
Hi, I'm Sophie Antel-Gibert, Head of Portfolio and Business Consulting at Russell Investments. If you liked what you just saw and heard, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel or check us out on LinkedIn. Thanks for tuning in.